Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us from Johannesburg is Pusch Commey. He is an author and associate editor of New Africa magazine. Also with us from Beijing is Wenping. She is a professor and director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Also with me here in the studio is Dorina Bekoe. She is an associate professor at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies here in Washington. Welcome to all of you to the show. Pusch Commey, let me start with you in Johannesburg. What is your assessment of the economic difficulties now facing South Africa? How serious is this?
Well, basically, the economic difficulties boils down to one thing. Most people and most commentators have said that it's structural. Structural in the sense that since the transition to democratic rule in 1994, the blacks in South Africa feel that they've not been able to enjoy the liberation, dividend, and that has boiled into a whole debate on the subject, by which now politicians are calling for radical economic transformation. But on the flip side also, we do see that the South African economy is pattern, is enjoying negative growth. The most recent Q1 figure showed that the growth rate was only 0.5%. And as a result, without growth, you do have unemployment of 27.7%. And also, you have declining industries with a company like Ford pulling out of South Africa. So that paints a pretty dire situation. And it's also basically colored by politics, by which many people in South Africa also feel that there is bad governance. So that, in summation, is some of the difficulties that the economy faces. It's shedding jobs, it's not growing, and there's all this contestation on the basis of race as to in which direction that the country should be going.
Okay, Dorina, the ratings agency Standard & Poor recently downgraded South Africa's rating. This was after a cabinet reshuffle, which resulted in the firing of the country's finance minister. So we see this political upheaval, this political uncertainty. To what extent does that contribute to South Africa's economic woes?
Well, it contributes to it because on the outside external investment side, there is very little confidence as to whether or not the situation in South Africa politically is sufficiently stable enough to guarantee growth. That political situation has really been quite rocky. And that's a huge contributing factor.
Well, we're also joined right now by Tshepo Kgadima. He is the Chief Executive Officer and President of LontohCoal Limited. He also joins us from Johannesburg, and he's also a member of the ruling African National Congress. Tshepo, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show. Let me start with you. What is your assessment of South Africa's economic problems right now?
Well, greetings from Johannesburg. Well, listen, at this point in time, I think we are in for difficult times in South Africa. We are in difficult times in that there is a multiplicity of diverse voices as to what should be the appropriate macroeconomic policy for South Africa. So even within the African National Congress, on the eve of the policy conference, which starts this Friday, that question has still not yet been resolved. And as a result, we see that translating into the government itself, in that the various ministers, I'm aware that even today, the economic cluster of government ministers met with the president to present an economic recovery plan. But in my mind, it is very difficult to really be able to start to implement for as long as there is this multiplicity of diverse voices on what should be the macroeconomic policy of the country to be pursued. And by and large, that is not really, I think, a factor that there is one faction that is a lot more having its way in terms of which way the policy direction should be, but that we just haven't had that unison in terms of the economic policy view.
All right, Tshepo, the president, Jacob Zuma, addressed these issues in Parliament recently. This is what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
This situation is of serious concern to government, given the impact on our economy and also directly on our people. It is also worth highlighting that the economy, however, low, expanded by 0.6% on a year-on-year comparison between the first quarter of 2016 and the first quarter of 2017.
So, Tshepo, you mentioned a moment ago that the president's economic team has been meeting. They are formulating an economic plan to get South Africa out of the problems that it faces right now. What are the key elements of that plan?
Well, they haven't yet been revealed, but one of the things that the Minister of Finance and the new Minister of Finance, that is effectively rehashing the old plan. That is of, we must bear in mind that South Africa currently is sitting under a mountain of debt. And it is no longer sustainable for South Africa to maintain the sovereign debt that it has, to the extent that we have surpassed the 50% debt to GDP ratio. So one of the interventions that they are thinking about is that of selling what are some of the remaining state-owned companies in what they call non-core and non-strategic assets, in order to realize some of the proceeds there towards the debt. But in my own opinion, that is not necessarily an appropriate measure that actually needs to be taken. We have to bear in mind that South Africa for a long time now has pursued the macroeconomic policy of neoliberalism. And the result of that has been that the very big companies, the large companies, and I would say top 80 companies in this country, they are sitting on a mountain of a cash pile that is valued at about, what, 800 billion rand in US dollar terms. You are effectively looking at well over 400 billion dollars or thereabout. Now, they are not investing it into the economy, and the hope was that the private sector would lead the investment specifically into the productive sectors of the economy, manufacturing, mining, as well as in agriculture. But if anything, we have seen a decline right across the board in these key sectors, and that resulted in a much higher unemployment rate, specifically in the last 14 years. So there's supposed to be a tonic that we would hope that the economic cluster of ministers that met with the president today would come up with. But in my own opinion, unless they're starting to really assert themselves on what is the appropriate macroeconomic policy for South Africa and allow state interventionism using the state-owned enterprises to be able to lead in some of the investment into the economy, I think the difficulties are just unfortunately only going to get worse. And that is the challenge that you have. The Minister of Finance has met with the rating agencies, has met with some of the investors in our sovereign bonds, and most of them, they are effectively advocating for the business as usual. But whereas within the African National Congress, there is a growing number of people that are advocating that there has to be state interventionism. And it's about how the minister will be able to bring about these two very diverse points of view, to really be able to say, this is what is appropriate for South Africa. But I think it's going to be a very difficult time in the next, between now and December, when the ANC goes to conference, because we have to bear in mind that any policy that is suggested during the coming weekend can only be adopted and ratified in December.
Okay, let's bring in Ho Wenping. She is in Beijing. And Ho Wenping, there is a close trade and economic relationship between China and South Africa. It's formerly known as the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. China's Vice Premier Liu Yandong was recently in South Africa. How important is China's role in South Africa's economy?
Yes, we have just heard our colleagues from South Africa they have mentioned South Africa's economy now is not in good shape. It's coming down, and also the unemployment rate is very high. So given these circumstances, I think that makes China's role in South Africa's economy becoming most important because we all know China is the biggest trade partner with South Africa, and also South Africa is the #1 investment destination for China's investment. So in the recent years, those investment and also the projects coming from China in South Africa, now I think it's getting more and more rather than getting less and less. And China's investment and China's company, they have also made a contribution for to give this opportunity of the job, for creating job opportunity for the South Africans. Plus, I think there is two new areas for the economic growth rate. That is, one is this called blue economy, ocean economy, and also the nuclear, I think nuclear power for generating those electricity. That kind of issue, I think, has been mentioned also by President Zuma and from the ANC government. So those new economic growth rates should be developed. That can make some new chances for this economic coming up. We all know because South African situation is not unique just for South Africa alone. It happens also to those emerging countries. For example, within this BRICS family, this BRICS club, and then South African economy is not good, and plus like Russia, like this Brazil, they're all in a very negative situation. Only the China and the India now seems performance is still good. So it's not just South Africa, because it's coming from this international economic situation, those pressure coming from international market, and also because this raw material price is still in very low point. So that makes those pressure goes to South Africa becoming more and more.
We need to take a quick break right now. Much more on the challenges facing South Africa as it tries to pull itself out of an economic recession. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.